The Chinese government responds to the protests taking place all across the country. You can see this short clip of tanks now running across the streets, many bystanders, many other COVID goons in their outfits, oppressing free-willed people who are tired of being locked down, people who have played their part for long enough and have said, we're done with this crap. So we're going to listen to several responses from some of the leaders around the world, so-called. Fauci is saying, gosh, these lockdowns are pretty intense over there. These things are pretty serious. And, gosh, you should really think really thoroughly before you make drastic decisions like this, which is obviously ridiculous because he was the lockdown extraordinaire here in the United States. We've got Trudeau. We're going to check in with our friends in the UK. But let's get our bearings straight and see what is actually going on there in the streets in China. And this came over from Kiola. At Kiola Wong posted this November 28th at 5:39 p.m. And here's what it looks like on the streets of China. Tanks rolling across the streets, traffic stopped. We see the COVID individuals barricading both sides so the tanks can make their way to their location. Not a welcome image. We know what tanks running around the streets of China look like historically. This is another video. You can see some of the COVID goons there in the back. They're literally like purging the streets of people, right? I mean, look at that force. There are a ton of individuals there. Now, we've covered many protests on here. We spent a lot of time talking about Ottawa in Canada. We covered a lot of the Netherlands stuff. And I think there's been some others we've covered that are escaping me at the moment. But right, this is a pretty big show of force. Like they're obviously using their totalitarian capabilities in ways that the other countries were not able to do, right? In Canada, they had to deal with it until they turned into dictatorial, insane lunatics. But here, China, they can just skip that step, right? There are no civil liberties for people to complain about. There's nothing for these people to latch onto and demand their rights, right? And they don't have any firearms to protect themselves either. And so they don't even have to play around. They just bring out the full force of the Chinese government. More videos. We saw this one. A lot of people coming in. All right, so you can see that is happening, and we've got one final clip here. More tanks rolling down the streets. So again, in China, right, people who want to be free, people who want to live their lives, everywhere around this world you look, the disgusting government is just trampling over people, oftentimes just telling us it's for our own good. Doesn't matter what country, what language you speak, what religion you're a part of. Everywhere you look, the government is disgusting, even halfway around the world in China. All right, so that is what's taking place there on the streets. So, keep your thoughts out for the good people, in China who don't deserve any of that. Let's close that one up. Now, there's also marches that are being conducted by the people. So while the Chinese military is rolling in with their tanks, the people are still marching. You can see on this street, groups of Chinese people marching for their freedom, tired of being locked down, And this is a pretty big deal, right? People are recognizing this is not what you're used to seeing, right? In other countries, protest is kind of a normal thing. In China, this is not a normal thing. This is very, very abnormal. And the fact that everybody's out there, right, willing to sort of literally walk across the streets is pretty incredible. And I think a lot of people are pausing to take note of that. All right, so we'll see how long they can hang out there. Now, we're going to check in with what some of these these world leaders, Fauci and Trudeau, have to say. We'll also hear from the newest prime minister over at the UK. They're going to give us their takes on what's happening in China, some of the stuff that we just saw. So we'll check in with them before we get to the Chinese drones and this distinction between American anarchy and Chinese control. I think it's a very important thing that is going to explain a lot of what the future will hold for us. And we'll get to all of that right after we talk about gold. Because, my friends, as you know, if you have an IRA, a 401k, or a savings account, things are scary out there. The Biden administration has already printed more money in the past 2 years than the previous 100 years combined. The national debt hit a record $30 trillion. It's climbing. Inflation's the highest we've seen since 1982. It's only a matter of time before the house of cards comes crashing down. If you have a retirement savings, your money could be at serious risk. Talk to my friends over at Goldco to see how you can protect your retirement with gold and silver before it's too late. Go to robertlikesgold.com. They'll give you $10,000 or more in free silver when you open a qualifying account at robertlikesgold.com. Goldco is an A+ rated business with the Better Business Bureau, and they're good friends of the show. And thank you for supporting them. Go to robertlikesgold.com. All right, so now that we've spent several days and weeks understanding what the Chinese people are doing, protesting, and what the Chinese government is doing in response, we're asking ourselves about these lockdown policies. And Fauci finally comes out and is a little bit skeptical about these lockdowns. Hey, Dr. Fauci, you were the genius behind the lockdowns here in the United States of America. You told all of us that we were killing each other if we didn't do everything you said exactly right now. What do you think about these lockdowns that the Chinese government is doing? Are you a little jealous?
China's official news agency today published an op-ed asserting that the country's strict COVID measures are scientific and effective. Are they?
Well, when you want to shut down in order to interrupt immediately a process that's going on, like the spread of infection, there should be a purpose to it. Like you want to make sure you get enough ventilators or enough PPE, or you want to get your population vaccinated.
Yeah, like set like an end date or something, like 15 days to slow the spread or something like that, right? It's just 2 weeks. That's the end goal. It's just 15 days. What kind of a terrorist are you? Why don't you just lock down for 15 days to save your fellow citizen? Is that the kind of goal he's talking about?
The comment that I made about their severe actions that they've taken is that you have to have an end game. What's the purpose? If the purpose is let's get all the people vaccinated, particularly the elderly,
gobbling up power,
then okay, for a temporary period of time to do that. But they have very, very strict type of a lockdown. They're locking people in their homes.
So did you.
Really, they can't even go out and, from what I hear, shop or walk a dog or something like that.
That's what you were arguing for.
A lot of pushback on the part of the population if there's no underlying purpose of what you want to do.
Well,
Exactly. Fauci's saying, wow, these are pretty serious. These are pretty harsh. Fauci wanted people fired for not getting jabbed up. All of this. Now, he didn't come out and say fire everybody who didn't get jabbed, but, he came out show after show after show. We sat through it here for months. You guys got sick of it. You're like, Rob, leave it alone already. You're driving us nuts. And now he's saying, wow, those lockdowns are pretty strict over there. He was praising China and their lockdowns. He was saying things like, gosh, I really wish we had those dictatorial powers so that we could do the same thing. And of course, now all of them are rewriting history as they're having to deal with reality. Total liar and loser. Now, same story goes over with this guy. Justin Trudeau, the dictator from Canada, of course, opines about freedom and liberty all around the world when he just got done crushing it in his homeland. Trudeau is asked about the Chinese protests. And as a defender of democracy and a purveyor of liberty around the world, Justin Trudeau has a message for those heroic Chinese protesters.
Canadians are watching very closely. Obviously, everyone in China should be allowed to express themselves, should be allowed to share their perspectives, and indeed protest. We're going to continue to ensure that China knows we'll stand up for human rights. We'll stand with people who are expressing themselves. We also need to make sure that China and places around the world are respecting journalists and their ability to do their job. We'll continue to make.
So he's way more interested in Chinese people having their liberties and their right to protest than he is about Canadians, because they invoked the total dictatorship psycho clause that exists in the Canadian Constitution, and they imposed his will however he wanted. And they wrapped up those protests, which were done very peacefully, which were done according to the law. They had to change the law because they were getting beaten as a result of their own insane policies, which would have forced many of those people who were there protesting, many of those people who were there for the exact same reasons that the Chinese protesters are there. They're protesting for liberty. They're protesting for their livelihood. That's what the Chinese protesters are doing. That's what the Canadian protesters were doing in Ottawa as part of the Freedom Convoy. Two double standards. Because, of course, my friends, he doesn't care about democracy or liberty or protests. He hates protests. He's okay with protests as long as they're a global way and he doesn't have to think about it and he can come out here and gurgle out some platitudes for us. What a joke. All right, so that's him. Now, of course, we remember that his goon squad was out there roaming the streets of Ottawa, beating up peaceful protesters, and we covered that for a long time here, and it was outrageous what we saw. And so shout out to our Canadian brothers and sisters who are living under the oppressive regime there in Canada. Yeah, Scott Tix is in the YouTube chat. He's over here. We got Paul Minot in locals. He's in up that direction. Right. Viva left because it's such a joke. All right. But shout out to our Canadian friends. We love you guys. All right. And so we've got one final clip from our friends over across the pond in the UK. This is the new prime minister from the UK speaking out against China, which is not something we hear out too often from these global leaders. And here he is saying that the golden era is now over.
We also need to evolve our approach to China. Now, let's be clear, the so-called golden era is over, along with the naive idea that trade would automatically lead to social and political reform. But nor should we rely on simplistic Cold War rhetoric. We recognise China poses a systemic challenge to our values and interests, a challenge that grows more acute as it moves towards even greater authoritarianism.
Yes.
Instead of listening to their people's protests, the Chinese government has chosen to crack down further.
Pretty interesting, surprising statement from our friends over there. And where is Joe Biden? Has anybody heard him say anything about what's going on there in China? We've got dictator Trudeau, we've got UK, we've got a lot of other leaders around the world who are speaking out against this, but not Joe Biden. Now, he's been pretty quiet because he's a big fan of China. So is Hunter Biden, his son. But we've got some interesting things to talk about. Now, the jumping off point of this was from the UK. He said that China is working towards more authoritarianism, more control, a stronger technological dictatorship. And we're seeing a lot of that pop up. Now, as I said, we're going to bounce over to Rumble. And of course, we'll keep streaming on TikTok and on locals. So on Twitter, not TikTok. Don't get TikTok. Don't ever use that app. On Twitter, we are going to continue that. But we've got two clips first. We have one of these Chinese drones. We're going to do a quick clip of social credit score, and we're going to read this article before we bounce out of here. So get ready for that if you want to join us on the jump. This is a clip of Chinese drones floating around the skies all across China, shouting at the peaceful protesters, "Get back inside, stay home, or we are going to arrest you." Screaming at the people on the streets, automated drones with cameras, presumably. Now take that clip and let's juxtapose that with this clip. This clip is floating around on Twitter. We're going to watch the full thing in the after party, but we're going to watch the first minute here. This person has been to China. He is communicating about the social credit score system that's already been implemented. He's saying this stuff is coming down the pike any day now because they were prototyping this stuff years ago.
If you go to China, they're piloting it a few years ago in Shenzhen. So I lived overseas. If you go to Shenzhen, back in 2017, they already had facial recognition cameras there. So if you jaywalked in Shenzhen, they would immediately detect that and send you a notification, and they would deduct money from your what they call WeChat account. They use two main apps, WeChat and Alipay. So you can actually deduct your money directly from your account. This is 4 years ago, so this is not like some sort of conspiracy theory. It's not something that's going to happen 10 years into the future. This happened pre-corona in China. And so this system in China that exists is extremely advanced. They can detect if it's a man or a woman. They can guess your age. They can detect what kind of car model it is, who the manufacturer is. This is a sort of technology that we see in all these dystopian sort of films and whatever. And people keep putting it off and thinking that this is something that's going to happen later in my kids' lifetime or my grandkids. It's already here. And if this gets implemented anywhere, especially in a Western nation, it's not going away. Israel is already talking about the fourth shot. Then they're going to be going to herpes, and they're going to ask if you're gay. They're going to be asking if you ate 3 pizzas this week because it's unhealthy. If you buy certain books in certain countries, your country doesn't like you. You'll lose points in the social credit score system. So
very, very troubling stuff. And that's not crazy stuff, right? This is not theory. He's explaining what's actually happening and what was happening as far as 2017, right? And how much more insane have things gotten since that time. So, nuts. Now, I wanted to share this article with you. This came over from a book called The Network State. It's available at thenetworkstate.com. It's an open source book, so it's free. It's all available. It's written by a guy called Balaji Srinivasan. And I wanted to share it with you because I think it's a great article, and it helps to, it's actually part of the book, but it's linked up as an article. Anyways, he details what this sort of spectrum of the world might look like. Right now, we have sort of a bipolar political spectrum in the United States. We've got the conservatives, the Republicans, allegedly. Then we've got the liberals, the left, right? And we have them on the spectrum. But there's another bigger spectrum that might exist in terms of social order across the world. And we have heard the World Economic Forum. We've heard many people talk about a multipolar world. And the United States is not the unipolar world. We've got different competing powers and sort of a multipolar world where China and other entities can compete with the United States. The United States doesn't make the decisions for everything, right? So if this new world emerges and the United States facilitates this by withdrawing from the world stage, what might happen, right? And the U.S. seemingly is doing that. It doesn't matter what party is behind it, right? The U.S. is sort of incapable of continuing to extend control over the entire planet. The United States is withdrawing. We're going to see that their capacity follows. All right, so let's get into this article. He's going to detail what this spectrum looks like for us. On one side of the spectrum, American anarchy. And let's ask ourselves, right, if this is happening right now. On the other side of the spectrum is Chinese control. And in the middle, there's going to be this gray area where he calls the international intermediate. He says, all right, we're going back into a sci-fi scenario, but let's game this out. The U.S. could descend into a chaotic second American Civil War. The CCP responds with the opposite, right? Chaos in the United States leads to a second Civil War, and he details what this sounds like. The CCP will not allow that to happen in their home state. So they go to the opposite extreme, total surveillance state. that traps wealth in the digital yuan network, and the rest of the world, if we're lucky, builds an alternative startup society. But he says, look, to be clear, you don't need to believe in this scenario to build any of these things. He says other people have talked about how the world order might be descending, and he's explaining the different buckets that this falls into. He starts with America. American anarchy. Are we going to have prosperity, tyranny, or anarchy? Right? Which one is it going to be? We'd all like to see prosperity, certainly. But let's see what he says. The progressive vision is that the West is getting more free, more equal, and more prosperous, if you believe that. The dystopian vision is that we're all actually in the incipient stages of tyranny, whether that be fascist or woke tyranny, respectively, we don't know. But what's under-theorized is a third possibility, namely that in the U.S. at least, the inconclusive power struggle between Democrats and Republicans really is useless. It means that America is headed for anarchy. As the events of 2021 unfolded, it became clear that even with unified control of the federal government, Democrats were no more effective than the Republicans had been earlier. Neither faction could do anything to gain total domination that their party wanted and that the other party feared. But meanwhile, the nonpartisan state capacity of the United States, which means the ability of the U.S. to do things and to get things done, state capacity. Do you have the capacity to do certain things? If you call our law firm, yeah, we got the capacity to represent you on a criminal case, but not on a family law case because we don't do that. The U.S. capacity doesn't have capacity for most things now. It's continuing to visibly decay. Squint past the pandemic's half-ignored TSA-like COVID regulations, and you saw a half-ignored TSA-like COVID regulator. Namely, a failing state that people did half ignore and arguably had to half ignore because the USA itself was the TSA, and the TSA they knew was safety theater, right? In other words, the whole government became the TSA. The CDC, Dr. Fauci, right? All of the infrastructure that's meant to save us and protect us, we all think that they're a joke now. Today, in the territory governed by this inept bureaucracy, we now see power outages, right? We've talked about this in Texas and other places. In California, right? Year after year, rolling outages. Supply chain shortages, rampant flooding, uncontrolled fires. We see riots, arsons, shootings, stabbings, robberies, murders. We see digital mobs that become physical mobs. We see a complete loss of trust in institutions from the state and the media. We see anti-capitalism, anti-rationalism. We see states breaking away from the federal government, which is what we've talked about here. We've seen this, right? Carrie Lake was promising this as part of her campaign. Greg Abbott in Texas has been pushing back against the federal government. Texas, Louisiana, suing them in many instances. Missouri saying, don't come in here and tell us how to run our gun laws. States breaking away from the government at home and abroad. At the end, we see the end of power, the revolt of the public, the defeat of the military, the inflation of the dollar, and looming ahead, American anarchy. Now, what's coming isn't fascism or communism like the left wing and the right wing pundits would have us believe. Even though they don't believe it themselves, what's coming is the exact opposite of that. A world where the civilized concepts of freedom and equity are extrapolated to their de-civilizational limit, where you ain't the boss of me and we are all equal, where all hierarchy is illegitimate, and with it, all authority, where no one is in charge and everything is in chaos, right? That we're trending towards that. We can argue that this may be preferable to the status quo, in the same way that we think of chaotic Russia in the 90s was on balance better than the authoritarian Soviet Union in the 80s. What's better? Total control or total anarchy? Because the state can't maintain order. They can't even keep the power on. And it's going to get worse, is what he says. We can argue it may be inevitable, as the Chinese proverb goes, quote, the empire long divided must unite. Long united must divide. And we can argue that this transitional period of anarchy may be lamentable, but it's better than the other team being in charge. But he says, I think that prior to our rebundling, we're on track for quite an unbundling. He says, with that introduction over, let's get down to specifics. Rather than seeing an indefinite continuation of the post-war order or a second Cold War between the U.S. and China that many are preparing for, the U.S. may be on track to descend into an American anarchy, a chaotic second American Civil War between the U.S. establishment and its people. We foresee two main factions in this new Civil War. The first will align around the U.S. federal government, the New York Times, the establishment media, the wokeness, the dollar, and the Democratic Party. They'll say that they're fighting for, quote, democracy, and they're fighting against insurrectionists. The second group will align around state governments. Oh, interesting. Something we talk about here. Decentralized media, maximalism, Bitcoin, and the Republican Party. They'll say that they're fighting for freedom against fiat tyranny. Now, we can't predict their names, but rather than Democrat blue and Republican red, he says, let's call them the wokes and the orange, the Bitcoin orange. So dollar green and dollar orange. Now, he says America, right? He gives us some factors here. This is a great book, by the way. But he says, how could something as radical as the Second American Civil War happen? You could write a book on this, but he's got a couple of ideas here. One, we've got political polarization all the way up. All the graphs show this now at the top, basically, levels. The U.S. is not really a nation state anymore, but it's a binational country comprised of two warring ethnic groups that disagree on the fundamental moral premises. It's about God, gays, and guns, but it's also about censorship, surveillance, and inflation. State capacity is way down, right? The component or the competent America of a mid-century is not working anymore. The left-right fusion that FDR put together, the America that combined the powerful central state with social conservatives, right? That is gone. That America depicted in the movies, it's over. The U.S. government can't build a bathroom in San Francisco. And we made a whole video about this. It took them 20 years in San Francisco. This video is on our channel. 20 plus years to create a bathroom in San Francisco. And it's like another 5 years to finish the other two. It's over. The country is incapable of doing basic things. The government can't build a bathroom, let alone an effective fighter jet, a destroyer, a combat ship, or an aircraft carrier. Economic prosperity is declining. All the political infighting of the last decade happened during a period of prosperity. You're already seeing articles that we're going to be eating bugs and living in pods now. We have envy increasing all across the country and the world. This is normally phrased in terms of inequality, right? We're unequal. That's one way to look at it, but let's look at it and rotate it a few degrees. Let's talk about it in envy terms. The return of the great fortunes, the rise of social media, the decline in religion has led to envy escalating. Every day, people can see others online who appear to be better off than they are and who appear to be rising while they're falling. Whether that rise is real or not, whether it's due to another person's own efforts or not, doesn't matter. Everybody feels like other people are getting more while they are falling behind. Foreign military defeats, crushing the U.S. capacity. Leaving aside your feelings about the pandemic, the military propaganda is worth reviewing. In 2018, the U.S. DoD put out press releases on its preparation for the pandemic. They said, we've got very sophisticated technology to solve this, but nothing happened because the military was completely unprepared. This was the first time many in the public had the opportunity to directly compare statements about the secret military programs to the actual results. How many billions did we spend on that and where did it go? The size of the gap was remarkable. At least some of the U.S. military was just words, he says, not real, right? All of there were supposed to be competency around any of these things. There wasn't any. Biology talked a lot about that previously. U.S. states are pulling away from the feds. We've talked a lot about that on this channel. There's enormous coverage of U.S. politics on the national level because that gets clicks from everybody. But local politics doesn't get the same attention. But if you've been paying attention, multiple states have been saying, we're going to handle things on our own. Things like guns, immigration, abortion, gambling, marijuana, and others. This part is future is our past. It's reversing the 10th Amendment repeal by FDR's government and more broadly, going back to Western decentralization, which is what we want. 7, authority has lost respect. The old American left said something like, we all need to work for the common good. While the old right said something like, pay your dues and you'll achieve the American dream. Also, turning into a joke because your dollar is inflating away every single day. The new left says, quote, we are all equal. And the new right says, you ain't the boss of me. So the old left-right combination, self-supported, self-sacrifice, and stable hierarchy, while the new one attacks all hierarchy as fundamentally illegitimate. You see, there was a nice balance. Self-sacrifice, you'll get a stable hierarchy. The left says common good protections. The right says work hard. You can balance those two. But in this case, in this new world now, that's not what we see at all. Every side says any hierarchy is oppressive and tyrannical. It's reflected in the defacement, the degradation of every U.S. institution over the last few decades. Even the founders and the Capitol are no longer sacred. Nobody cares. They're pulling statutes down all over the place. We're discussing national divorce. Secession is now officially part of the platform for Texas Republicans. And there have been an increasing number of pieces on a national divorce, and he cites many of them. Radicalized movements reject the status quo. There have been countless words written on wokeness and how it's radical ideology that thinks the U.S. is intrinsically corrupt. Many people are behind it. But the thing about wokeness is that it's not just a superficial weed growing out of the topsoil. It has a root system, a theory of history and ethics that's built on thousands of papers, on generations of academic humanists, on Foucault and Derrida and the like, and deconstruction and critical race theory and so on. I happen to think of this as a mostly evil doctrine. Fact check true. As sophisticated evil promoted in the name of good, but I recognize it has ideological content. The Republican Party isn't really capable of dealing with that, obviously. They have no idea what they're doing. They can't even respond to it. In fact, many of them are playing the same game, right? Going along with it, lest they be castigated as being a bigot. But Bitcoin maximalism is. If you haven't heard of it, he says you will. It's a very important ideology that a lot of people haven't heard about. We've hinted about it here. You can read about it in the Bitcoin Standard or any one of these other books. But he says there could be a trigger event. And for Balaji, he says the trigger event might be the U.S. seizure of Bitcoin, right? And he uses that as sort of as an analogy to the seizure of gold back during FDR's reign, right? So if the U.S. financial system continues to crumble and everybody goes over to Bitcoin, which is probably, going to be one of the most hardest currencies that exists ever, this is not financial advice, this is not legal advice, all of those disclaimers. But if that were to happen, right, if this case were to happen and that becomes the hard money, just like gold was the hard money back then, he says the government moving to seize that money, seize that Bitcoin, would cause both sides to be in basically catastrophic positions, right? The Bitcoiners couldn't back down and the government couldn't back down. He says a U.S. establishment attempt to seize Bitcoin in a time of high inflation would be like a repeat of FDR's gold seizure, except that this would be done in a time of declining state capacity, right? The state doesn't have the ability to do anything about this. We're going to seize it. And everybody says, well, we don't really trust you. We're not going to give you anything. He says the reason something like this could be the trigger event is neither side is backing down. Wokes would have no power if their government goes bankrupt because nobody's using their monetary system. So they have to go pull the money from, or the crypto elsewhere. And maximalists would have no money. The Bitcoiners would have no money if they surrendered to the state. So something like that could trigger a literal, second American Civil War. And the rest of this article, this is a whole book. So you can read the whole book on it. It's very, very interesting stuff over from Balaji. He's saying, wars are not something that he favors. And he games out China. On the other end of the spectrum, he talks about Chinese control. He says that China will introduce loyalty. They're going to shut down opposition. They're going to create their version of U.S.-style democratization, right? So everybody gets to vote and participate in their authoritarianism. They're going to inculcate Chinese nationalism. Just like the U.S. has gone through the Great Awakening since 2013, Chinese society has been driven into a phase of ultra-nationalism. So the U.S. has gone the opposite direction, right? The U.S. is, according to the wokesters, is terrible, garbage country. But according to the Chinese, right, China's incredible, ultra-nationalism. China also is building a surveillance state. Much of this has been written, but the sheer scale of what has been built has not been understood well. While it's worth being aware of Gell-Mann amnesia, which is another concept that we've talked about, Gell-Mann amnesia is like if you're reading a newspaper, and I'll use myself as an example. If I'm reading a newspaper, let's say I open up the New York Times, and I read the New York Times and I see there's an article there about criminal law and about prosecuting somebody with a DUI or something. I could read that article and I could say, this is total nonsense. The journalist here, the author, doesn't know what the heck they're talking about. This isn't even close to criminal law. It's inaccurate, right? But I would know that because I'm familiar with that subject matter. Now, if I turn the page and I see an article about, brain surgery, and I read that article, I'd say, wow, that's interesting. I had no idea that they could do that type of brain surgery. That's pretty amazing. What a great world we live in, right? And I would take a look at that article and I would suddenly forget that the newspaper is garbage because I know that the article on the prior page that I do know about is inaccurate. So why would I suddenly think that if I turn the page over that the next article would suddenly be accurate? He's saying, okay, this is actually an area where the U.S. establishment media is closer to reality than it is domestically, in part because it's a relative to the Chinese state. You see all of the additional bullet points, but misbehavior in China, as we heard about from the gentleman in the prior video, it will get you removed from WeChat, which is like unpersoning you. It's hooked into all the services. And so if you're removed from there, you can't get access to anything. And China also might sell their technology to other governments, okay? Export their software, just like iPhones are exported or just like, technology is exported in other forms. The Chinese government can export their technology. Both China and the US have sold surveillance technology to the globe, but one difference is that China can execute better in the physical world. So smart cities built with Chinese technology have full stack surveillance. They'll point to a harmonious society. And if there's a coup in China, the US establishment calling for a coup, right, the whole world could be sort of exploding into a tinderbox. So very interesting book, very interesting articles here. So I'd encourage you to go check that out at thenetworkstate.com if you want to read more. But that, my friends, is it for us.